Under the golden haze of a dying summer afternoon, the road to Hollow Creek stretched quiet and dusty, winding through fields that had long forgotten rain. A single wagon rattled over its bends, the wheels creaking like tired bones. The reins were held by a young woman whose eyes carried the stubborn fire of someone who had learned too early that survival didn't wait for kindness. Her hat sat low over her brow, shadowing a face browned by the sun and wind, and the faded hem of her dress told stories of more miles than she cared to count. She wasn't meant to be here, not really. Just a month ago, she'd been working at the mill in the next town over, until the foreman decided men did the loading better than women. The pay had stopped, and so had her meals. When old Mrs. Greeley from the general store mentioned she needed someone to take weekly supplies out to the cabins near the ridge, the young woman hadn't hesitated. Delivering goods was work, hard, lonely, and dangerous for a girl traveling alone, but it was work all the same. That morning, Mrs. Greeley had loaded her wagon with flour sacks, dried beans, a few tools, and mail for the mountain folk who didn't come to town often. "You'll be fine," the old woman had said, handing her the reins. "Just don't linger up there after dark. Folks say strange things happen near the old Carter cabin." The girl had laughed then, but the sound hadn't lasted long. Hollow Creek had always been a place of stories, about ghosts, lost gold, and men who rode with more secrets than words. Out here, silence was a kind of language, and those who lived far from the town had their reasons. By late afternoon, the sun was dipping behind the ridge, painting the sky in amber streaks. The road narrowed as she drove higher, the trees closing in until even the air felt still. The wheels thudded over stones, and somewhere in the brush a hawk cried, breaking the silence. She told herself it was just another day's work, just another delivery. But the closer she came to the cabin, the heavier the air felt. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew about the man who lived up here. No one seemed to know his name. He was just the man in the Carter cabin. Some said he was a drifter who'd struck gold and lost it. Others whispered he'd once been part of a cattle gang that vanished after a robbery years ago. Whatever the truth, he didn't come to town, didn't talk to anyone, and didn't ask for company. But he always paid for his supplies in advance, every coin clean and silver. She wasn't supposed to be curious. Curiosity was a dangerous thing out here. But as she steered her horse up the last hill and saw the outline of the cabin through the trees, she couldn't help it. The place looked almost forgotten, tucked into the clearing with smoke curling thinly from the chimney. A few cattle grazed near the fence, their hides shining like bronze in the fading light. Whoever lived here wasn't poor. She stopped the wagon a few yards from the porch, brushing dust from her skirt before stepping down. The ground crunched beneath her boots. She knocked on the wooden post beside the door, half expecting no answer. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the door creaked open. The man who stepped out looked like someone carved from the same rough wood as his cabin. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a worn leather coat, his hat tilted low enough to hide his eyes. A faint scar traced the side of his cheek, catching the last light of day. He didn't speak, just looked at her with a stillness that made her heart stumble a beat. "I brought your supplies," she said, her voice more nervous than she wanted it to sound. "Mrs. Greeley sent me, said you were expecting them." He nodded once, slow and deliberate, then stepped down from the porch. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the distant hum of cicadas. When he reached for the sacks, she noticed how steady his hands were, strong but calm, like he'd spent his life handling more than just tools. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked, trying to fill the quiet. He looked up then, and she finally caught a glimpse of his eyes. They were sharp, clear, and carried something she couldn't quite name. Loneliness, maybe, or guilt. It wasn't the look of a simple man. There was something buried deep there, something she knew better than to ask about. He gave a small shake of his head and went back to unloading. Still, when she handed him the last parcel, his fingers brushed hers, just a flicker of touch. And for a reason she couldn't explain, her breath caught. "Anything else you need?" she asked softly. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You come up here alone?" She hesitated. "It's part of the job." His jaw tightened. "This road isn't safe for that. I've managed fine so far." The faintest hint of something, maybe concern, maybe warning, passed through his eyes before he turned away. "Next time, come earlier," he said, stepping back toward the porch. "Don't stay past sundown." She wanted to ask why, but his tone left no space for questions. As she climbed back into her wagon, A strange chill ran through her despite the warm evening air. The man had gone inside, but she could still feel his presence, heavy and distant, like the mountains themselves were watching. Halfway down the trail, she glanced back. Through the trees, the cabin stood silent again, the smoke from its chimney thinning into twilight. For a moment, she thought she saw him still at the doorway, watching her leave, but when she blinked, he was gone. That night, when she returned to Hollow Creek, Mrs. Greeley was locking up the store. "You saw him then?" the old woman asked. "I did," the girl said. "Didn't say much," Mrs. Greeley gave a knowing nod. "He never does. But you best be careful, dear. That man's not what he seems. Some folks say he's richer than anyone in this valley. Owns half the cattle and land from here to Silver Bend, though he don't live like it. Keeps to himself. Always has," the girl frowned. "Why would a man with that kind of money live like a hermit?" Mrs. Greeley sighed, glancing toward the dark hills beyond town. Maybe he's hiding from something money can't fix. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The man's voice, rough, quiet, and weighted with something unspoken, lingered in her thoughts. There was a mystery in that cabin, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it pulled at her. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was pity. Or maybe it was the feeling that their meeting hadn't been chance at all. A week later, when Mrs. Greeley asked her to take another delivery, she agreed without hesitation. The older woman gave her a puzzled look. "You sure you want to go back up there?" She nodded, tucking the delivery note into her pocket. Someone has to do it. The road to Hollow Creek felt different that day, warmer, quieter, and yet somehow full of waiting. As the wagon wheels turned, she caught herself wondering who the man truly was before the silence took him, before he built that cabin at the edge of nowhere. What she didn't know was that the man at the cabin already knew who she was, knew more about her than she could imagine. And as she drove up the ridge for the second time, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. Because this time the man wasn't waiting for supplies, he was waiting for her. The next morning came with a cool mist crawling over Hollow Creek. The girl woke early, though she hadn't slept much. The echo of the man's voice had followed her into her dreams, low even, and somehow familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have heard it before. She moved through her morning chores with a restlessness she didn't understand, brushing down her mare and checking the wagon before heading into town. Mrs. Greeley was already sweeping the porch of her store when the girl arrived. "You look like you saw a ghost," the older woman said with a chuckle. "That mountain air must have chilled you." "Maybe," she replied, keeping her tone light. "You said you had another order?" Mrs. Greeley nodded, motioning toward the back of the shop. "He sent word down with a rider yesterday. Wants extra feed, some cloth, and a new lantern. Paid double for fast delivery." That caught her attention. "Double?" Never questions the price either. Mrs. Greeley paused, eyeing her curiously. "You didn't say much about him when you got back last week?" "There wasn't much to say," the girl murmured. "He's quiet. Doesn't talk unless he has to." "Quiet men are the ones you ought to listen to most," Mrs. Greeley said, lowering her voice. "They think before they speak. And sometimes they're the ones hiding the deepest truths." The girl didn't respond, but the words followed her as she loaded the wagon. The weight of them sat in her chest all morning while she rode. The trail to the ridge felt different now, not as lonely but more uncertain. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way the wind hummed through the pines, the faint marks of horseshoes along the road that didn't belong to her wagon, and a patch of land recently disturbed near the old creek bed. Halfway up, she stopped to rest her mare and looked toward the ridge. From this height, she could just make out the line of smoke curling from the cabin's chimney again. He was there, waiting. When she reached the clearing, the man was already outside, stacking logs near the woodpile. His movements were methodical, steady, the kind of work done not for need but to fill time. He turned as she approached, lifting his hat slightly in acknowledgement. "You're early," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Mrs. Greeley said you wanted your order quick," she replied, climbing down. He nodded, stepping closer to help unload the wagon. Again, the silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. This time she didn't rush to fill it. She studied him instead, the rough edges of his coat, the faint trace of gray at his temples, the way his eyes seemed to search her face as if trying to place her, too. When the last crate was set down, she handed him the folded note Mrs. Greeley had written. "That's everything." He unfolded the paper, glancing over it briefly before tucking it into his pocket. "You didn't have to come yourself," he said. Could have sent someone else. Didn't have anyone else, she answered simply. And besides, I don't mind the ride. For a moment she thought she saw something soften in his expression, a flicker of something unguarded. But it vanished almost as quickly as it came. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Your pay. She took it, feeling the weight of the coins inside. You always pay more than you should, she said, studying him. Why? He looked toward the trees. It keeps people from asking questions. That answer settled over her like a chill. She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone warned her off. Instead, she turned to climb back onto the wagon, though curiosity gnawed at her. Before she could leave, he spoke again. The old trail behind the ridge. Don't ride it, he said firmly. Storm washed part of it out. Dangerous ground. She nodded slowly. I'll remember that. Good, he said, and with that, he turned back to his work. As she steered the wagon back down the hill, the image of him standing there stayed burned in her mind. Alone, framed by his cabin and the endless wilderness beyond. There was something about his quietness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like exile. Back in town, she stopped by the blacksmith shop to repair a loose wheel. The blacksmith, a burly man with soot-stained hands, looked up as she approached. You been riding the Ridge Road? He asked. I have, she said. Why? He leaned on his anvil, lowering his voice. You know who lives up there, don't you? Not exactly, she admitted. No one seems to. The blacksmith spat into the dirt. Used to be a man named Carter owned that land. Rich cattleman. Had a wife too. But one winter she disappeared. Folks said she drowned in the river, though her body was never found. A few months later, Carter vanished, and someone else started sending money for that property under a new name. Could be coincidence. Could be the same man just hiding from what he'd done. The girl felt her stomach tighten. You think he's Carter? I think he's someone with a past, the blacksmith said. And folks with pasts like that don't go looking for company. That night she couldn't shake the story. The man in the cabin, was he really hiding from something or from someone? The more she thought about it, the less certain she felt about everything she'd seen. The scar on his face, the loneliness in his eyes, the way he seemed almost startled when she spoke his name last week. It all began to add up to something she couldn't yet name. Days passed before she went up again. She told herself she was only doing her job, but the truth ran deeper. Each delivery seemed to pull her closer to the ridge, to the quiet man whose silence was beginning to speak louder than words. This time, when she arrived, the air smelled of rain and pine. The cabin door was open and faint music, soft from a harmonica, drifted from inside. She stopped listening. The melody was slow, mournful, carrying an ache she recognized but couldn't explain. When he noticed her standing there, he stopped playing, almost embarrassed. Didn't mean to interrupt, she said gently. He shook his head. Wasn't playing for anyone. Sounded like you were, she replied. Sounded like a song someone left behind. His eyes met hers then, steady, guarded, but with a glimmer of something unspoken. Maybe it was. A storm broke before she could leave, trapping her under the porch as rain swept across the clearing. They stood in silence, the steady patter filling the space between them. She glanced at him once and caught the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. You shouldn't ride down in weather like this, he said. Road'll be nothing but mud by nightfall. I'll be fine. He shook his head. No, you'll stay here till morning. The certainty in his tone surprised her. You're offering me shelter? Offering you sense, he said simply, though there was no sharpness in his voice. She hesitated, watching the rain spill over the edge of the roof. All right, she said finally. Just for the night. He nodded, motioning toward the fire inside. There's stew if you're hungry. As she stepped through the doorway, she couldn't help but notice how carefully everything inside the cabin was kept. The furniture was simple but solid. The shelves held books old but well read. Above the hearth hung a framed photograph. 2 people standing in front of a ranch house. A younger version of him stood beside a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. He noticed her looking and turned away, his shoulders tense. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. She was your wife? He nodded once, his jaw tightening. She was. What happened to her? He didn't answer. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and she knew better than to press. Still, the sadness in his expression said enough. Later, when the storm eased and the night grew deep, she lay awake on the cot near the fire. Through the crackling wood, she heard him moving outside. Footsteps on the porch, the faint click of a lantern being set down, then quiet again. Something about the stillness felt heavy, like secrets pressed against the walls. She wanted to ask him what he was hiding from. She wanted to know why someone with money, land, and solitude looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. But before she could find the courage to ask, a sound split the night, a distant gunshot echoing from somewhere beyond the ridge. The man burst through the door, eyes sharp, hand on the rifle hanging by the wall. "Stay inside," he ordered, voice steady but tense. She sat up, her heart pounding. "What's happening?" "Trouble," he said shortly, already moving toward the door. And then, without another word, he vanished into the storm-soaked dark, leaving her alone with the firelight and the growing fear that she'd stepped into something far larger than she understood. The girl sat frozen, listening to the wind howl through the trees, waiting for the sound of his return. But all she heard was silence, and in that silence, the unmistakable echo of another shot ringing across Hollow Creek. The echo of the gunshot seemed to hang in the air long after it faded into the storm. The girl sat motionless by the fire, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket. The flames flickered across the cabin walls, throwing restless shadows that moved like ghosts. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the door made her heart jump. She wanted to run after him, to see what had happened. But something in his voice when he left, steady but sharp, kept her rooted where she was. Minutes turned into an hour. Rain drummed hard against the roof, and thunder rolled over the ridge like distant hooves. Then faintly through the storm she heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, coming closer. The door opened, and he stepped inside, soaked to the bone, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His hat dripped rainwater, his jaw clenched tight. She rose quickly. "What happened?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he said, voice rough with strain. He shut the door behind him and set the rifle against the wall. "Was someone out there?" She pressed. His eyes flicked toward the window, then back to her. "Maybe. Or maybe just someone testing how close they can get." She frowned. "Testing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the table, his hands steady but his shoulders tense. "You should get some rest. The road'll be bad come morning." But she couldn't sleep. Not with the storm still raging and questions clawing at her mind. When he finally sat by the fire, she watched him quietly. There was something different in his face now. Harder, older. The silence between them felt thicker than before, full of things unsaid. After a while, he noticed her staring. "You're not afraid, are you?" he asked. She hesitated. "Should I be?" A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "Not of me. Then who?" He looked into the flames for a long time before answering. "Men who think I owe them something I don't." She waited for more, but he said nothing else. When morning came, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest heavy with mist. The wagon wheels sank into the mud as she steered down the hill, and she kept glancing back at the cabin, half expecting to see him still standing there, rifle in hand. But he was gone from sight, swallowed by the fog. In town, Hollow Creek was already buzzing with talk. A stranger had been seen the night before, riding fast through the valley. Some said he was a bounty hunter, others whispered he was after the man on the ridge. The girl stayed quiet, listening, feeling the weight of what she now suspected, that whoever the man was, his past wasn't just lonely, it was dangerous. Mrs. Greeley caught her arm as she passed the store. "You went up there again, didn't you?" She nodded. The older woman's eyes narrowed. "You listen to me, child. There's a reason that man lives up there alone. He's got trouble trailing him, and it'll reach anyone who gets too close." "Trouble found him last night," the girl said softly. "There were gunshots." Mrs. Greeley's face paled. "Then you best keep your distance. Hollow Creek's been quiet too long to invite old ghosts back." That night, the girl couldn't rest. Her thoughts kept circling back to him, the way he'd spoken, the fear he'd tried to hide beneath calm words. Against her better judgment, she found herself saddling her mare again the next morning, heading for the ridge. The road was slick, and mist still clung to the ground. When she reached the cabin, the place looked different. The door was open, and the woodpile had been knocked over. Inside, the table was overturned, a chair broken. She froze, her pulse hammering. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. From the back of the cabin came a faint sound, movement, then the quiet creak of a floorboard. She stepped forward, gripping the handle of her basket like a weapon. Then he appeared, leaning against the wall, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. His face was pale, but his eyes still sharp. "You shouldn't be here," he said. though the edge in his tone was softer than before. "You're hurt," she said, rushing toward him. "It's nothing," he replied. Trying to stand. "It's not nothing," she said firmly, tearing a strip from her apron and helping tighten the bandage. "What happened?" "Someone came in the night," he said quietly. "Looking for something. What?" He looked at her then, a long, heavy stare. "Gold." The word hung between them like smoke. She blinked. "Gold? You mean you—" "I found it years ago," he said, cutting her off. "Didn't want it, but men killed for it anyway. I left it behind, changed my name, came here. Thought time might bury it, but time doesn't bury greed." She sat back, stunned. "And they think you still have it?" "They always do," he said. "As long as I'm breathing, they'll keep coming." Outside, a crow called, sharp and hollow. The sound made them both turn toward the window. He straightened, wincing slightly. "You need to go, now. If they see you here, they'll think you're part of it." "I'm not leaving you like this," she said, shaking her head. "You can't fight them alone." "I've been fighting alone a long time," he said almost gently. "And I've made peace with what that means." But she didn't move. Something in her refused to. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was the pull of something she couldn't yet name. "Then I'll stay," she said. "At least till you can stand on your own." He studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're either brave," he said finally, "or foolish. Maybe both." A faint smile flickered across his face before fading again. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, she helped patch the broken door and sweep the cabin floor. The quiet between them wasn't as cold now. It was steady, even comforting. But beneath it, she could still feel the tension like a wire pulled too tight. Every sound from the woods made them glance toward the trees. When darkness fell, he lit a lantern and set it on the table. "If they come again," he said, "you hide behind the cellar door." No arguments. She wanted to protest, but saw the determination in his eyes. She nodded. Hours passed. The forest outside was still. Then, faintly, came the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He rose instantly, hand on his rifle. The girl's breath caught. A voice called out from the shadows beyond the porch. "Evening, Carter." The man froze, the name hung in the air, heavy and accusing. "Thought you were dead," the voice continued. "Guess the rumors were wrong." He stepped forward, rifle ready, but didn't fire. "You've got no reason to be here," he said evenly. The stranger laughed, a low, mocking sound. "No reason? You owe me, old friend." "You took what was mine. I took nothing," the man said sharply. The girl pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. Through the thin wood, she could see shadows shifting outside, 2, maybe 3 figures. "Armed. Last chance," the stranger called. "Tell me where it is, and maybe we'll leave you in one piece." The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back." But before he could finish, a shot shattered the night. The window behind them exploded, glass spraying across the floor. She ducked, covering her head, the sound of gunfire ringing in her ears. He moved fast, firing back through the open doorway, each shot precise and calm despite the chaos. Then, silence, only the rain beginning again, soft and steady. He lowered his rifle, breathing hard, eyes scanning the clearing. "They're gone," he said after a moment. "For now," she looked at him, shaken. "They'll come back." "I know," he said quietly. He turned away, looking out at the trees, his expression distant. "I can't keep running," he murmured. "Not anymore," she stepped closer. "Then don't. Let someone help you this time." He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw the fear behind his calm. Not fear for himself, but for her. "You don't understand," he said softly. "What they want, it isn't gold anymore. It's revenge." The words chilled her to the bone. Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance. Somewhere deep in the woods, the faint glimmer of a campfire flickered to life. Proof they weren't alone on the ridge. The man watched it from the window, his jaw tightening. "It's starting again," he said under his breath. And the girl knew then that the quiet life she thought she'd found in Hollow Creek was gone forever. The ridge held more than secrets now. It held danger, betrayal, and the shadow of a past that refused to die. As the night closed in around them, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the storm gathered strength, and the sound of horses drifted faintly through the dark, getting closer. The next move wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to whoever was coming up that mountain road. The fire had burned down to embers, throwing only faint light across the cabin walls. The man stood at the window, watching the flicker of campfire flames deep in the woods. His rifle rested on the sill, ready. The girl sat at the edge of the table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee, listening to the rain tap softly on the roof. Neither had spoken in a long while. Words didn't seem to fit what hung between them anymore, just the weight of what was coming. "They won't wait till morning," he said finally, voice low. "They'll move before dawn." She looked toward the door. "How many do you think there are?" "3, maybe 4, he said. "One of them's a man I used to know. He'll want to finish this himself." She wanted to ask what this meant exactly, but she already sensed the answer wouldn't be something easy to hear. "Then we have to get help," she said. "If we ride now, we can make it to Hollow Creek before sunup." He shook his head. "No, if they see us on the road, they'll cut us down before we're halfway down the ridge. They'll wait until I step outside, then they'll take their shot." She set the cup down, her pulse quickening. "So what are we supposed to do? Sit here and wait to die?" He turned from the window, his expression calm but resolute. "No, we make it cost them to come for me." The way he said it sent a chill through her. There was no panic in his voice, no anger, just the steady certainty of a man who'd lived too long on borrowed time. He began checking his rifle, laying out ammunition on the table in neat rows. She watched, torn between fear and frustration. "You can't fight them all," she said. "Even if you hit 1 or 2, the rest will burn this place down with you in it." He paused, looking at her. "That's why you're leaving." Her throat tightened. "No, yes," he said quietly. "You'll take the back trail through the pines. Follow the creek till it splits, then keep east. You'll reach town by daylight." "I'm not running away," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't your fight." "Maybe it is now," she said, standing. "You think I can just walk away after everything? After what I saw last night?" He studied her for a long moment, then looked down. "You remind me of her," he said softly. "My wife." She'd have said the same thing. The words hung in the air, raw and heavy. She waited, not daring to breathe. "She believed in doing what's right," he went on, almost to himself. "Didn't matter what it cost. That's what got her killed." The room went silent again, save for the faint hiss of rain on the chimney. The girl swallowed hard. "That's why you live up here," she said quietly. "You're hiding from what happened." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was there, written all over him. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. He glanced at the window and straightened. "They're moving," he said. She stepped closer, heart pounding. "What do you see?" "Lanterns," he said. "They're circling to the east. Trying to box us in." He crossed the room and handed her a revolver. "Do you know how to use it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I can manage." "Keep it close," he said. "If they get inside, you shoot first." She took the weapon, her hands trembling as she checked the chamber. Outside, the woods had gone eerily quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing but the sound of boots crunching in wet soil somewhere beyond the clearing. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the trees. "Carter, we know you're in there! Come on out!" The man didn't flinch. He moved to the doorway, keeping to the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," he called back. His voice carried steady across the rain. "You'll regret it." A rough laugh answered him. "You had your chance 10 years ago. All you had to do was share what you found, but you got greedy. I buried that gold," he said. "Left it to rot. Then you can die with it." The voice spat. The girl's breath caught as the first shot cracked through the night, shattering a lantern on the porch. Glass rained down, sparks flaring against the wet wood. He fired back, the rifle's report echoing through the trees. Another shot followed, then another. "Get down," he ordered, motioning her toward the back wall. She crouched behind the overturned table, clutching the revolver. The cabin filled with smoke and gunfire, flashes of light splitting the darkness outside. When the shooting stopped, the only sound was the ragged hiss of rain and the distant click of boots on gravel. He reloaded quickly, jaw tight. "They're not done." Through the haze, she saw movement near the tree line, a figure darting closer than another. One crept along the side of the cabin, the glint of steel in his hand. She raised the revolver, her breath shaking, and fired. The gun kicked hard, and the man outside stumbled back with a cry. Her pulse roared in her ears. He glanced toward her, eyes sharp but full of something like pride. "Good," he said. "Now stay low." More shots tore through the walls, splintering wood. The fire in the hearth flared and died, throwing them into near darkness. The storm outside had grown heavier, rain pounding against the roof like drumbeats. "They'll try the back," he said, moving toward the rear door. "If they get through—" The door burst open before he could finish. A tall man stepped inside, drenched and grinning, a pistol in hand. "Missed you, old friend," he said. "Still hiding behind walls? Still stealing from others to build your own?" The man shot back, raising his rifle. The intruder laughed. "I didn't come for gold this time. I came to watch you pay for what you took from me." Their eyes locked, the tension between them thick as smoke. The girl could see it now, the years of betrayal buried in that stare. Whatever had happened between them, it had cut deep. The stranger stepped forward. "You ruined everything. My brother died because of your lies." "He died because of his greed," the man said quietly. The stranger's face twisted. "Then you'll die for it." The next second, chaos erupted. The stranger fired first, the bullet grazing the man's shoulder. He staggered back, firing in return. The shot hit true. The stranger fell, crashing against the doorframe before sliding to the floor. But the moment of silence that followed was brief. Two more shadows appeared in the doorway, shouting, guns raised. The girl fired again, hitting one in the leg, while the man took the other down with a clean, hard shot. Then there was stillness. Just the sound of rain, heavy and cold, washing through the broken windows. The man lowered his rifle, breathing hard. Blood seeped from the wound at his shoulder, dark against his shirt. She rushed to him, catching his arm. "You're hit." "It's nothing," he said, wincing. "We need to move before more come." "More?" she asked. "They won't stop till they're sure I'm dead," he said grimly. She looked around at the cabin, the shattered walls, the smoke, the bodies in the doorway. "Where will we go?" "There's an old mine east of here," he said. "It's where it started. Maybe it's where it ends." They moved quickly through the rain, the forest closing around them. The air was thick with mist, the ground soft underfoot. He led her along a narrow trail that twisted through the pines, his pace slowing as his injury worsened. She tried to steady him, but he waved her off. "I can manage," he said, though his voice was faint. "Not alone," she answered. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." He looked at her then, and for a moment, she saw the man he must have been before all of it. The one who'd loved, lost, and buried his past under years of silence. "I used to think solitude was safety," he said quietly. "But maybe it's just another kind of prison." They reached the mouth of the mine just as lightning split the sky. The entrance gaped dark and cold, a wound in the mountain. She hesitated. "You're sure about this?" He nodded. "If they're still out there, this is where they'll come looking. And I intend to finish it here." Before she could reply, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, a gunshot close. The bullet struck the rock beside her, sending shards flying. "They found us," he said, pulling her toward cover. Figures emerged through the rain. 3 men, lanterns swaying, their voices carrying on the wind. "You can't run forever, Carter," one shouted. "We'll burn this whole ridge if we have to." The man raised his rifle, grim determination settling over his face. "Then we'll see who burns first," he murmured. The girl gripped the revolver tighter, heart hammering. Thunder rolled above them, the storm swelling to its peak. She knew this was it, the moment everything would break open for better or worse. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking them to the bone. The men advanced, shadows moving through flashes of lightning. The man beside her drew in a slow breath, steadying his aim. "Stay close," he said quietly. "No matter what happens." She nodded, the fear in her chest mixing with something else. Resolve. And as the next flash of lightning tore across the sky, the mountain erupted in gunfire, the sound echoing through Hollow Creek like the storm itself had come alive. Neither of them spoke again. There was only the fight, the rain, and the sense that everything they had both been running from was finally catching up to them. The night after everything fell into chaos was the first one in months that didn't feel like it would ever end. The fire in the hearth at the cabin had burned low, and the wind outside pushed softly against the shutters as though the mountain itself was sighing in relief. She sat by the table, her hands still trembling, watching the shadows stretch and fade over the wooden walls. Across from her, the cowboy, the man whose name she finally knew, though it still felt strange on her tongue, sat in silence, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. It had been only a few hours since the gunfire stopped echoing through the trees, but the memory of it clung to her like dust. The men who'd come looking for him, the ones who wanted his land and what lay beneath it, were gone now, their threats buried with the broken wagon near the creek. The law would handle what was left of that mess, but for tonight, the mountain was quiet again. She finally spoke, her voice soft and unsteady. "You should have told me." He didn't look up. "Would you have stayed if I did?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. It was hard to know what she would have done. The truth had changed everything she thought she knew about him. He wasn't just a lonely rancher with a few cattle and a dark past. He had once been one of the richest men in the valley, a ranch owner who'd lost his fortune to betrayal and greed, only to rebuild it in silence, far from the eyes that had once envied him. The gold he'd hidden wasn't what made him rich anymore. It was what he'd built after, his land, his herds, his quiet strength. But he'd kept it secret to protect himself, to keep trouble from finding him. Trouble had found him anyway. She set her hands on the table, leaning forward a little. "You didn't have to go through all that alone." He finally looked at her then. The lines around his eyes had deepened, not from age, but from years of carrying too much on his shoulders. "Alone was safer. I made my choices and I paid for them." She nodded slowly. "Maybe, but you saved me tonight. That means something." He gave a small shake of his head. "You didn't need saving. You stood your ground when most would have run." His gaze lingered on her for a moment before softening. "I reckon I owe you for that." The words hung between them, heavier than the silence. She didn't know what to say, so she just looked into the fire instead. It was strange. How much could change in so little time? A month ago, she'd been just another girl looking for work in a dusty little town that had long stopped caring who came or went. Now she was sitting in the cabin of a man who'd once owned half the valley, wondering how the two of them had ended up tangled in the same story. When dawn came, the first light spilled over the ridge like a promise. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and smoke. She stepped outside, watching the mist rise off the creek. The mountain looked peaceful again, untouched by the fear and noise of the night before. Behind her, she heard the door creak open. He came out quietly, his coat hanging loose over his shoulders. "They'll be sending folks from town soon," he said. "Sheriff will want to talk." "I figured," she said. They stood there for a moment, neither of them speaking. The sunlight caught on the edge of his hat, and for the first time, she noticed how tired he looked, not just in his face but in the way he stood. As if all the years of running had finally caught up to him, she turned to him. "So what happens now?" He looked toward the valley, where the road wound down toward Hollow Creek. "Maybe it's time I stop hiding. The land's mine fair and square. If the law wants to make a fuss, they can," she smiled faintly. "You could come back to town, you know. People wouldn't recognize you now. Maybe you could start again." He chuckled softly, the sound rough but genuine. "Town's not for me anymore, but maybe I'll start something new here. A ranch that means something this time." She nodded, understanding more than he said. He didn't want riches or recognition, just peace. That was worth more than gold ever could be. Before long, the sheriff arrived with a couple of deputies, and after a few tense questions and a long explanation, they left satisfied. The men who'd caused the trouble were wanted in other counties, and the sheriff was glad to see justice done. When the lawman rode off, the quiet returned, leaving the two of them standing in the clearing once more. He turned to her then. "You don't have to keep coming up here for deliveries anymore. I'll manage." She studied him for a long moment. "Maybe I don't have to," she said, "but maybe I still want to." His brow lifted slightly. "Why?" she smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "Because this place doesn't feel as empty as it used to. And because you could use a hand, whether you admit it or not." For a moment he said nothing, then gave a slow nod. "You might be right about that." Over the next few weeks, the mountains settled back into their quiet rhythm. The sun rose and fell over the hills, the cattle grazed in the meadows, and the creek kept singing through the valley. She came back often, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to help mend fences or tend the horses. He never asked her to stay, but he didn't tell her to leave either. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing the corral, she looked over at him and asked, "When did you first come here? To this cabin, I mean." He paused, resting his hand on the post. "After I lost everything. I rode until I couldn't ride anymore. Found this place by accident. It wasn't much back then, just a few walls and a roof that leaked. But it was quiet, and quiet was enough." She nodded. "And you built all this?" He glanced around the open land, piece by piece. "Took years. I figured if I kept busy, maybe I'd stop looking back." She smiled softly. "Did it work?" He looked at her then, and for the first time the faintest hint of warmth touched his eyes. "Maybe it's starting to." The seasons turned slow in Hollow Creek. By the time the first snow dusted the mountains, the cabin had changed too. The fences stood straight, the barn was stocked, and laughter sometimes broke the silence that once ruled the place. It wasn't the same lonely ridge anymore. One evening, as the fire crackled inside, she sat by the window watching the snow fall. He was at the table, mending a bridle strap. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was easy, steady, like the rhythm of two lives learning to fit side by side. She broke the silence after a while. "When I first came up here, I thought you were the coldest man I'd ever met." He smiled faintly without looking up. "I probably was. But you're not now," she said. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. "Maybe you changed that." The words caught her off guard, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she looked back toward the window, smiling to herself. Outside, the snow was falling thicker, blanketing the world in quiet white. It was strange how life worked, how two lost souls could cross paths in a place so forgotten by time. She'd come to the mountains chasing work, thinking only of surviving another week. He'd come here to hide from a past that wouldn't let him rest. But somehow, in the middle of all that loneliness, they had found something worth holding on to. When spring came again, the valley was green with promise. The townsfolk began to talk about the man from the ridge, the one who wasn't so silent anymore, the one whose herds grazed freely, and whose cabin smoke could be seen from miles away. They spoke of how he'd changed, how the woman who once delivered his supplies had stayed. And though the road to Hollow Creek still wound through dust and quiet fields, those who traveled it sometimes said that when you passed near the old Carter cabin, you could hear laughter mixing with the wind. In the end, it wasn't wealth or gold that made the richest cowboy alive. It was the peace he'd found, the trust he'd rebuilt, and the quiet love that had grown where there used to be only silence. The mountain never forgot their story, and neither did the town. For years after, folks would tell it softly in the glow of lamplight, a tale about a girl brave enough to knock on a stranger's door, and a man who'd spent a lifetime waiting for someone to make him feel alive again.